I think that the way to understand why famine happens is to think about hunger right here in the United States, because we have 48 million people who are food insecure. 1 in 7 Americans are on what used to be called food stamps, the SNAP entitlements. And hunger happens in America, but no one in America would say the reason people are starving is because there's a shortage of food. You can go into a supermarket and find aisles bulging with food. The problem clearly isn't that America's not producing enough food. We've got plenty of food. The reason that people go hungry is because of poverty, and people are unable to afford food in this country. And that's why there is hunger in America. Now, it's hard to imagine that that's the cause of hunger elsewhere in the world, but in fact it is. And it's very much the same mechanism at work. When you have food distributed through the market, you set up a series of incentives, you set up a series of rules. And the basic rule is that if you have money, you get to eat, and if you don't have money, you starve. But in a time of famine, something else happens. In every major famine since the Second World War, there's always been food in the region. But what happens is that people who have food are able to sort of read the writing on the wall that there is hunger coming. And so if you are able to accumulate a lot of money, the smart thing to do is to buy food, because you know the price of that food is going to go up. If you can store that food and if you can make it available at some point in the future, you know that hoarding food now and selling it for $1 a bag or whatever the unit is, today will net you a profit, but tomorrow you could sell it for $2 a bag. And so why not hoard and then regulate the flow of that food out into the world again? And that mechanism of hoarding and of rationing through very rational market mechanisms leads to hunger. You ensure that people who are poor don't get the food and people who are rich get to make money. There are more calories per person being produced now than ever before in human history. So it's not even that we've got a lot of food, we've got a lot of food per person, more than ever before. So it's absolutely the case that we are able to feed everyone if we wanted to. But the systems that we have set up are inimical to feeding people when we distribute food through capitalism. The first international market in food in the modern era was the global market in wheat that was set up by the British through the course of the 19th century. And this is a process that's tracked beautifully by the historian Mike Davis in his book Late Victorian Holocausts. And he observes that the British, for example, set up through their colonization of India, overtook feudal land relations and inserted capitalist relations in labor and in the products of that labor in wheat. So what you had was, and as a result of the imposition of these market-based rules, India produced way more wheat than it had in the past. By the end of the 19th century, India was exporting millions of tons of wheat in the global wheat market to Britain, and the British workers found themselves, eating Indian wheat. But this came at a cost, and that cost, of course, was that by introducing these market mechanisms within India, levels of hunger went up because workers were unable to afford the fruits of their labor. And so, as a result of the imposition of markets in wheat, Mike Davis sort of tracks and sort of observes this powerful statistic that in the 2,000 years before the British came to India, there was a famine once every 100 years. But after the British came and after they had imposed their sort of international capitalist market, there was a famine once every 4 years. And so many more people went hungry at the same time as more food was being produced. Now that, I think, is important for us to understand today, because that's actually a fine example of the world that we're in at the moment, where we are producing way more food than ever before in history, and yet there are nearly 1 billion people who are going hungry. So you often hear about food riots, and particularly in 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2011, the world was strafed with what were called food riots. And the representation in the media of these events was of an angry mob tearing through some street, and a breathless journalist would rock up afterwards and sort of point to a burning tire and explain how the mob went wild and smashed windows and grabbed food and then disappeared into the night. But that's a fairly inadequate representation of what's going on, because in every protest around food, there's always politics. When the media reduces to the sort of irrational mob the actions of people who are protesting on the streets, they lose the biggest part of the story. Because when you see protests around food, what you're seeing is the actions of people who have run out of other ways of explaining and demanding change from their governments, and finding the food that they need to help their families survive. And so every food protest is also inevitably a protest about politics, and invariably those politics are very well articulated. So when you have food protests in Haiti, for example, these were protests about the high price of food, but also for the return of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was kicked out of the country in a coup that seems widely to be agreed that was sponsored by the United States. Now, recently we've seen more examples of that. In 2011, the series of protests around the Mediterranean that began to be initially as the Arab Spring, people forget that in Algeria, food protests began with a protest around the high price of food, the high price of wheat in particular. And these rebellions that began there they weren't all about food, far from it, but food was definitely a spark. And particularly the high price of food was a spark that articulated with people's inability to get and to wring change from government. And so, the upshot of this was big protests in the street, particularly around the price of food, but also about political transformation and political accountability. And I think it's ironic that the way that some leaders responded was merely to try and put the genie back in the bottle by lowering the price of food. In fact, that's what President Ben Ali did before he fled for Malta from Tunisia. The last law that he passed before he was chased off was to drop the price of bread. And that, that sort of gives you an indication of the way that leaders think about, the rioting masses outside their windows, and misunderstand that, in fact, what people demand is not just lower prices for food, but political accountability and the power to be able to transform their food system. But I think that's why food rebellions, to me, are not things to fear, but actually an expression of political dissatisfaction that can be very powerful. The idea of a riot is always represented in the media as a loss of order. But if the order was unjust and undemocratic, then that's no order that anyone should want a part of. And I think that food rebellions can and often have been in history a moment where democracy has flourished. And I think that's why food rebellions are something to be welcomed, because they are a rupture with an anti-democratic order that offer the possibility, though never the guarantee, of a more democratic future. There's always been a very rich history of resistance when it comes to food and food politics. I mean, peasant movements throughout the 19th and 20th century. I mean, one could go back to the Diggers, for example. I mean, there's plenty of fantastic history about resistance when it comes to food, land rights, and thinking about the way society can and should be. But particularly recently, there's been sort of a flourishing of movements from La Via Campesina, which began in the mid-90s, that is an international peasant movement that's now over 200 million strong, that involves everyone from the National Family Farm Coalition in the United States to the Brazilian Landless Rural Workers Movement. And you have these amazing groups that are doing a range of things, from occupying land to investigating and researching sustainable agriculture techniques and teaching those techniques to movements around the world, so that we can have this sort of vibrant, climate change ready agriculture. They're fighting the good fight against corporations, often occupying their land, sometimes destroying their crops in order to to save biodiversity and stop genetic contamination. There are so you have these kinds of direct action. You also have direct action that involves appropriating food and redistributing it. You have food not bombs that recruits. That is about redistributing food, giving away food for free, and which has been criminalized in the United States, incidentally. I mean, you're finding a range of movements around the world that are really going for the heart of the capitalist system by bringing into question how it is that we desire things, by bringing into question the need for private property, and by coming up with alternatives so that we can desire things in new ways, desire things collectively, and resist the sort of individuation of our tastes and of ourselves. I think that there are a number of movements around the world that people can look to and be inspired by.
Take these words home and think.